thanks a lot for coming. This is the 4th Manchester Fred, and we've got Stu Cox here tonight from Modernizr. I'm just going to quickly go over the sponsors. So, coming before, Fred is something that was set up. There's a Fred in the States as well, and it's basically just to get front-end developers together, talk about all the latest things that are happening, and just collaborate and help each other out within the web community. Tech Hub, Doug's there tonight, so thanks Doug for providing the space and pizzas and beer. Does an awesome job, so thanks very much. Absolute's where I work, and they've donated some money tonight to help cover the costs of like travel expenses and filming today. Also Reason Digital, who helped with that, and 3/4 production. So Chris is at the back filming, so if you need any filming or anything like that, recommend Chris, top guy. So thanks very much to the sponsors. So just briefly go over, first of all, the first commit was done by Paul Irish, and that was 4 years ago. So it's all on GitHub. Is anyone like following it on GitHub? So if you've come to previous Manchester Freds and things like that, one of the things that I love to do and where you can really learn from is just following the commits and comments and things like that on GitHub. And I really encourage you to just, if you can, do a pull request and try and contribute to things. Even if you're not quite sure, do it anyway, because you can always get, even if it's not going to get pulled in, it's really rewarding to see like people commenting back and just letting you know like where you've gone wrong or how you can maybe improve it. And it's great if you, obviously then it does get pulled in. So key players, I'm not going to try and pronounce all the names, read them. But also these slides will be available, and you can click the links and obviously like read up, find out more about them, who's interested in that. And there's also some really good resources on the web to find out, and again I'll put them there. And this is all going to be recorded, so this will be on the internet, and that's about it. So thanks very much. I'll hand you over to Stu.
Cheers. Yeah, so this is the awkward bit where I have to switch over to my slide, so bear with me a second. I think this talks to me about a little bit more than just Modernizr, because it kind of needs a bit of context really, and there's only so much I can talk about the code base of Modernizr itself. But essentially, Modernizr and terms like progressive enhancement, responsive design, mobile first, these are all kind of terms and ideas that are all about compatibility. Okay, so it's all about whatever you're building working across a number of different platforms, a number of different devices, and for various different users. So there's kind of like an accessibility side to it all as well. Because this is a talk, and need a dictionary definition, apparently. So, so when I'm talking about compatibility here, I'm talking about basically getting your app or your web, I like to get the term web thing rather than app or site, because it's just nice and, it doesn't try and tie anything down too much. Basically just trying to get that work with, make sure that fits nicely with however your user is accessing your app or your site. So a little bit of history, and some of you will remember some of this. If any of you guys don't remember this, then you're very, very lucky. We used to make a thing, make it look really pretty, and we test it in our chosen browser. Obviously, I'm just picking the browser at random, obviously. And you go, way, it works, brilliant. You then try it in another browser. Again, I'm just picking them at random, and it wouldn't work. So you'd have things like your bit of media, instead of having a nice video, you'd have a white box with a cross in it, and your buttons be in the wrong places, and your columns at the bottom would line up, and things like that. So you'd then hack the life out of it. There are so many websites dedicated to CSS hacks, it makes me feel a little bit ill to even talk about it. These little things of, oh yeah, this browser will pass this one won't, and so on, so you can use that to target specific browsers. Or in JavaScript, quite common to use user agent sniffs. So every browser says, this is the browser that I'm called, and you can try and run a regular expression over that to try and work out if it's the one you're trying to target. All of these are heuristics, so you're kind of looking at one thing when really what you're interested in is another. You're not interested in, does it pass, does the browser pass a CSS rule which starts with a star? You're interested in, has it broken my layout? You want to know it's a much better idea to focus on why your layout's broken rather than just, oh, it looks different in this browser, I'll nudge it. So heuristics just imply assumptions, and there's the old adage, assumption is the mother of all fuck-ups, and it's completely true. Every time you make an assumption, there is something that can and probably will at some point in the future slip through the net. So the example, the heuristics and assumptions we were making just there were that browsers that pass a certain hack in a certain way will also have a certain layout bug. Things that a browser that matches a certain user agent stream will also support a certain feature. You might say, okay, I know all the browsers that my users are using. Do you really? Have you really thought about that in the future as well? And the answer is probably not, because we can't all predict the future, basically. So even if you do think you know about every single browser, I did a quick check on using Can I Use, because it summarises stats quite nicely. At the moment, there are 85 browser versions which have got more than a 0.1% market share, which is a lot. And Facebook claim that they see 7,000 different devices every single day. So even if that was the limited set that you had to work with and you didn't have to think about the future, that's a huge number of different options that you have to test and work through. And also then you've got accessibility and different users on top of that as well. So it all becomes quite unmanageable quite quickly. So we just kind of go back to, if we've got two browsers, what are the differences between them? There are actually three sources of compatibility problems in my opinion: features, plugins, and bugs. And differences between those groups, I'm happy. Sorry, just a bit of fun. So examples of features, so these are kind of things that are in the spec. So there might be CSS3 features, things like font face and all sorts of like nice shiny things that we want to use. In HTML, so we now have native audio, native video, drag and drop, JavaScript stuff. There are a whole new load of APIs in HTML5 and so on. So that I kind of class those as the features. Then from the plugin side, Flash, Silverlight, Java, all that kind of stuff, you never really know whether they're installed just by kind of guessing. We certainly can't assume everyone's got Flash anymore, because Apple devices don't let you do it. Good problem for that. And then bugs include the classic IE6 rendering bugs and other things like Android, early Android devices, and in fact the one in my pocket has got a huge number of bugs in various different places. And I like to kind of group these three things together. And I say capabilities, because I think this kind of really helps us if we try and think of them all in the same way. Features are obviously a capability of the browser. Plugins add capabilities. Occasionally they take them away, but most of the time they add them. And then bugs are incapabilities. So if we start thinking of it in terms of, instead of it, oh, this browser's got this bug, what we're really interested in is we want to rely on the fact that other browsers don't have that bug. And I'll show you why that's a useful way to think about it. So this is just a kind of quote that I don't know if it's entirely true, but I like to sort of think in this way, which is that the differences between two users' browsers can entirely be described by the differences between their capability sets. So, progressive enhancement. Where does this all fit in? Progressive enhancement is about providing different experiences for different users, depending on their capabilities. You've probably heard all sorts of analogies for progressive enhancement, like an escalator, when the electricity dies, it's still a set of stairs. That's great. And then loads of people also talk about, okay, so if it's progressively enhanced, then it should work without JavaScript. I think that's all kind of a slightly old way of looking at it now, even though progressive enhancement's only been around for a few years. Really, it's simply about providing different things for different users who can experience it. So, I like to think of anything that we're building on the web as just a collection of features. Okay? There's the core, there's the things that every single user needs. And when I say every user, I mean every user. Okay? So that includes users who have sight impairments. It includes users who might be trying to just scrape the data by, for some other service. there are so many different kinds of users that might be interacting with your app. And this is literally the essential bits. And then anything else is an enhancement. Okay? And as I say, like, the core is smaller than you think. It is the absolute minimum required for whatever you're building to have any meaning. And this is kind of where the capabilities come back in. So we can say that there are core capabilities. These are the things that are required in order for it to function at a basic level. The fewer capabilities your core requires, the more users in total can make use of your app. So if the only capability you require is the ability to render HTML, then great. I think you can assume that every web-connected device will. Certainly this decade. If not, then. And then everything else is an enhancement capability. They're capabilities that if a user has them, then we can rely on them to make our enhancements and give them a fuller and richer experience. So just kind of some examples of enhancements. Basically any styling I consider to be some kind of enhancement. Okay, if you've got a user who is blind, then they can't experience your styling whatsoever. So if your styling was part of your core, then you're going to start alienating those users. Also, you've got things like fonts, animations, all these kind of nice, lovely things that we like to put in. Even a background image might just be a nice to have, or it could be a whole functional part. So I've given an example of a chat feature here. In Facebook, they've got their messaging system, and then there's also the instant chat. If instant chat didn't work, it's fine, you can still use the messaging. It's kind of an enhancement, right? So if a particular user's browser didn't have the capabilities to run that chat feature, just don't give it to them. Fine, they can still get on without it. This is where I kind of start delving into my own terminology for a lot of things. So I like to think about atomic enhancements, okay? And by that I mean that any enhancement is either applied fully or not at all. Okay? It degrades gracefully. I think graceful degradation, as is probably a term a lot of you might have heard, that is kind of considered a dirty word because people used it to just kind of, I don't know, sweep things under the carpet. But I actually think it's quite a useful term. It basically says that when capabilities aren't available, we still want it to work and we don't want it to impede the user. If an enhancement isn't atomic, then bad things happen, basically. So you end up with broken layouts, you get JavaScript errors, things go bad, and they go bad for the user, but it affects the user, it gets in their way. So here's kind of a simple example of something that won't degrade gracefully. So this is a non-atomic enhancement. We basically decided for this particular module, we're going to start using box sizing. I don't know how good your CSS knowledge is, but this basically changes the way that the box model works for laying it out. We've then used some styling based on that assumption that we're using this box sizing border box. Now, if box sizing isn't supported, this layout's going to go funny. Okay. Similarly, in JavaScript, if you try and use a function that isn't supported in the browser, then it's going to throw an error. That's going to cause other code not to run. You've got it's not an atomic enhancement. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that the enhancements that we add to our core are atomic. They're either there so a user whose browser can deal with it sees it, or we don't want it to get in the way and cause problems for those users who haven't got that. So 3 ways to do that. You either start avoiding dependencies, i.e. not using nice new shiny browser features. Now that's a bit of a Luddite way to do it. We want to be using this stuff, and people who are getting the latest devices and upgrading their browser, they should be getting rich experiences. You can also put in safety nets. These are quite difficult to make work a lot of the time, but essentially having something that will just happen to fall back nicely when you put something in place. Or there's feature detection, which is obviously what Modernizr is all about and what the rest of this talk is going to be about, really. So feature detection, if you haven't heard this term before, is testing if browser offers certain capabilities. The basic pattern that you might follow in JavaScript will be, if I have this feature, then implement something. I can then implement my entire enhancement here. Otherwise, provide some kind of fallback if we decide that's a good idea. These are some of the techniques that are used. I think particularly when people start using Modernizr, they kind of think of the way that feature detection is done is kind of possibly a bit of a black art. It's not at all, it's actually surprisingly simple. So one of the basic ones we use is for geolocation. We literally just see if there's a geolocation object on an application object. Does it stick is kind of mostly for styling. So all browsers, if they don't support a particular style value that you try and apply, then when you try and set it, if you read it back, it won't stay there as a value. So this is what we do for filter. We try and set a filter, and then we basically check that there is actually still a value, still a style value there. And then the next step, which is kind of a bit further on, is does it work? So we actually try and use it. Now, the general pattern, and I'll go into a bit more detail about this, is if we can do a really, really quick detect, and that works in every browser we know about, great, we've won. And there are certain browsers that will look like they've got an API, but it doesn't actually work. Unfortunately, Chrome is actually the worst for that, surprisingly. We have to do a slightly more involved test, and then these kind of actually testing it in full cases, we resort to if we have to. That's the only way to do it. But they're slower. We don't want slow detect because normally you detect at the start of the page. It slows down page rendering and things like that. Media queries, to me, that's another kind of feature detect. So in the world of responsive design, I'm sure a lot of you would have come across media queries. You basically have querying features of the viewport or features of the device screen, and you can do that in JavaScript as well. And yeah, that's another kind of feature detect. There's also now native detection. This is only in a couple of browsers. It's in Firefox nightly, it's in Opera, and it's in Chrome Canary. But Firefox and Chrome will both be rolling that out into their stable versions in the next few months. Which basically, at the moment it's only a CSS feature, but it essentially allows you to say, if I was to try and use this particular style, would it work? Do you understand it? This is kind of quite a major step for us. Paul Irish, who's also in the Modernizr team, is actually the guy who proposed this. We also want a similar pattern for JavaScript, because browsers should be telling us what they do in low support, but work on that is still taking quite a long time, and a lot of people are arguing about a lot of things. But it's the first time we've had a real contract of, the browser having to tell us whether they genuinely support something, which I think is quite a big step. So I mentioned fallbacks earlier. To me, there are three kinds of fallback. There's not providing a fallback, which, if you can get away with that, is always preferable because it's the most lightweight way to do it. It's easy to maintain, and it fits the pattern of you get an enhancement if you have the capabilities, and if not, then you don't, and it's fine. You can just deal with the core features of the app. There's also replacing functionality, so this normally requires quite a lot of heavy JavaScript, depending on what it is you're replacing. I think that there was a point at which everyone wanted to polyfill everything, and there are polyfills for so many HTML5 and CSS3 things that it's astounding what people have come up with, but ultimately you're trying to get potentially an older, less efficient browser to do even more work just to look a bit prettier half the time. So generally, I avoid polyfills wherever possible. I know a lot of other developers do the same, but occasionally it's necessary. And then there's providing alternative functionality, which I call sandwich filling. You're just kind of stuffing something in there so that it gives it a bit more bulk for the sake of it. And I try and avoid that at all costs, unless clients are absolutely desperate just to have an alternative that looks a bit prettier. So, on to Modernizr then. It's basically just a feature detection library. We've taken all of the feature detects we can find from various different places, loads of contributors from around the world, all using the kind of techniques that I suggested earlier. Some of them are much more involved, some of them are, just those kind of simple one-liners, and we put them into a library so there's one place to go to get all these things. It also adds some niceness to working with feature detection. So it presents a load of Boolean values on the Modernizr object. So testing for things is really, really easy. You don't need to remember what the feature detect is. Just use ours. Just get on with it. It's easy. Again, fallback's always optional. And it also adds classes to the HTML tag in your document. So it'll add both a yes and a no case, basically. So here we've got geolocation as a class and no geolocation as a class, depending on the result. That makes it quite easy because although you might be detecting a JavaScript feature, it may be, so in this case with geolocation, it may be that if the user isn't able, if the user's browser isn't able to report its location, then actually our layout might have to be different because there might be a part of our app that we need to hide. Something like that. It's got a custom builder, so that in my opinion, this is actually the best bit of it, is the fact that you can and you should just select the bits that you need. There's a Modernizr dev version at the moment, which includes a handful of what we kind of call the core detects. But it's a really bad idea to put that into production because it's big, it's slow, it's doing loads of stuff that you don't need. So fine for a bit of development, but once you actually get into serious production, use the custom build system. And I'll talk a bit more about the future of that in a second. Modernizr also allows you to add your own tests, so if they decided to add a Yoda element to the W3 specs, who knows, then that might be a feature detect for it. You could just add that yourself, so that both means that you don't necessarily have to wait for us to include it in Modernizr, but it also means that if you have something that might not strictly be a normal feature detect, or might not be something that you think other people would be interested in, might be quite specific to your app, you can still add that in, and then you still get the same benefits of just being able to test it as a Boolean, but also getting the class detection. So that's always really useful. There's conditional loading, which we use via a library called YetNode, which is written by one of the other guys in the team, Alex Hexon, who rarely sleeps. But essentially, so this package is particularly useful if either the code that you're plans to use certain capabilities is quite heavy, or if you are using a polyfill, and obviously you only want to load that heavy polyfill code if that feature isn't detected. So it's nice to have it in there as part of the Modernizr library. It's an optional build feature as well, or you can just grab YetNode from GitHub and use that individually if you like. So Modernizr 3.0 is what we're working on at the moment. Previous version was 2.6.2. Unfortunately, it's been quite a long time since that, and we're not able to do another 2.6 release for various technical reasons, mostly because we merged into master too early, they do that. But so all of our efforts going into this, and it is quite a big leap for us. So the entire internal architecture of Modernizr has changed. We're now following an AMD structure, so for those of you who don't know what that is, we're using a specific module format that manages dependencies, and it essentially, for each detect, we're able to say what its dependencies are. And what that means is we don't have a kind of bulk core that you need in order to create a Modernizr build. When you use the builder to select the bits that you want, everything that gets compiled in is the absolute minimum required to make that work, which is brilliant. So builds have got a lot smaller. It depends how many detects you're including, but for most of the builds I've done recently, it's been about 60% smaller, which makes a real difference. We've got a load more detects that unfortunately we weren't able to release as a 2.6 release. We've fixed loads of bugs. We've got a new feature which is Modernizr.on for handling asynchronous tests. So some of the tests, they take a bit of asynchronous action, much easier to handle with Modernizr.on. There's a polyfill for that actually on my GitHub, which I meant to mention on there, but I didn't. GitHub.com/Stu Cox. You can use Modernizr.on with a 2.6 build. And we're also now using the app supports rule under the hood when available. So I was talking about that earlier, that this is the contract which the browser makes that says, you know, if you ask me if I support a thing, then I'm I'm only allowed to say yes if I really do support it, and the community is going to be getting seriously heavy-handed with browser vendors if they don't stick to that contract. So we believe that that's going to be the future, and actually will eventually probably mean the end of Modernizr, which is a good thing. There's one less library you have to use, then that would be a good thing. But in the meantime, if it's there, we'll make use of it for much more reliable detection. If it isn't, then we'll stick to our usual patterns. We're also going to be moving to a much faster release cycle. It's likely that when Modernizr 3 launches, from that point onwards, our builder will be linked to the master branch in our repo. So as soon as bug fixes, new detects and so on are rolled in, they'll be available on the website straight away, which I think is really, really good. And it was actually probably one of the failures of the previous version was that things weren't fast enough. And because of the restructuring, it's making it a lot easier for us to write decent documentation, have documentation for every single detect. And you guys, when you use an Angry, you use the Grunt build tool, then check out Grunt Modernizr. It's already available for 2.6.2, but it's going to be updated for version, well, it has already been updated for version 3 as well. So it's using that dependency tracking goodness to be able to pull in a really, really small build and make it really, really easy to work with. I'll give you the link to these slides at the end, but it's also worth checking out Alex Sexton's slides about Modernizr 3. In fact, I think they were linked on your slides, weren't they? So he's kind of talked about a bit more about how he personally would use Modernizr 3 in a proper project workflow. And yeah, there's some good slides there. Right, so I didn't bother doing any slides for this bit because I left it too late to write them in the first place. But yeah, so Simon asked me to talk a bit about how I'm involved in Modernizr, how I got involved in Modernizr. So at any point, just shout out any questions if you've got them at this point. So I think it's probably worth saying that I started off just by following it on GitHub, as Simon was saying. It's a really, really useful thing to do. You then get notified of all the changes that go on, you get a feel for it. The reason that I did that was because I just wanted to know about some of the new things that were happening. Some of the first times at which I hear of new features that are coming into browsers are when the browser vendors submit pull requests to Modernizr for the text for the features that they've literally just written their C++ code for in the browser. So that happens about once a week. We'll get one of the browser developers actually submitting these things saying, we've just implemented this, we want to detect from Modernizr. So that was kind of how I started getting involved. So I was just keeping an eye on it. Every now and again I'd see a bug or someone would mention a bug and I'd submit a pull request or something like that. I started getting more involved when there were a lot of discussions around Modernizr.touch. So this is one of the detects is called Touch, and it was originally supposed to detect touchscreen capability. So is this a touchscreen device? Now, turns out that's a very, very difficult thing to detect accurately, and as time went on, we kind of realised that the detect in Modernizr wasn't really doing its job. There were too many false positives, too many false negatives. I'll talk about that a little bit more separately in a minute, but I got involved in those conversations and said a few things, basically saying Modernizr isn't in a place to be able to detect touch devices, and actually is not really in a place because of the JavaScript environment to detect many device features at all. Actually, a very, very small amount of information is provided to the browser and the document environment about the device. So there are a number of kind of statements and kind of backwards and forwards discussions, and the guys on the team seemed to like what I was saying. So ended up talking to them a bit more, and yeah, then got an email from Paul Irish saying, would you like to be a core team member? So yeah, I got involved. And since then, I've been doing a few hours a week on Modernizr, so keeping an eye on tickets. The app supports feature that I said is in Modernizr version 3, us using that behind the scenes. I wrote all of that. I also just make tweaks to tickets here and there, doing bits of documentation, adding new text if I think of them, all this kind of stuff. So yeah, and we try and keep most of our discussions public on GitHub because we think that's a really good thing. Occasionally there's when we sort of feel that we need a consensus, we'll have a discussion offline and then we'll go back onto GitHub to talk about that. So getting involved in that kind of stuff as well has been really good. And yeah, in March I went out to Texas for South by Southwest and met the other guys in the team. So I met Farouk Atesh, who started the project, although I don't think he's ever written a line of code for it, but it was a nice idea. Well done, mate. No, he manages the project really well and has a really solid vision for it. Paul Irish, who, as you say, did the first commit and is the lead developer, and I'm sure you guys know from all sorts of other things, it's amazing how much stuff he gets involved in. And Alex Sexton as well, who's top guy, did all the Get Node stuff. He tends to do a lot of the kind of behind-the-scenes infrastructure stuff on Modernizr. But yeah, I got to meet all of them, and that was really, really good. I also met a guy called Chris Rupel, who is responsible for the Modernizr module in Drupal. It's just a coincidence that his surname rhymes with Drupal. But yeah, met those guys out there, and yeah, that was really, really good. In terms of working on Modernizr as a kind of a large project, I don't think of it as a large project. So I think we've got something like 850,000 deployments at the moment. That many projects, and that includes Google, it includes Microsoft, it includes a huge number of different websites. We believe Facebook copy our text out and use them internally, but they'd never allow a Modernizr, the Modernizr global object to become visible on their website, of course. Things like that. But so it's used all over the place, but still, it's actually quite a small code base. That's by design. We want it to be as small as possible. Every detect should be as small and efficient as possible. But yeah, and all the time, I guess you just kind of know that as you're working on this, there are a lot of people who are interested in what you're doing. A lot of people have a lot of say into it. We get pull requests from all sorts of different people. Some of them have only been writing code for 3 weeks or something, and they just go, oh, I found this Modernizr thing, oh, that's quite good, I want this. And then they'll throw out a pull request, and that's great. Simon was saying earlier about, it's worth submitting the pull request, whether or not it gets accepted. I think probably 95+% of the pull requests we do get accepted, possibly after a bit of tweaking, but nearly all of them do get in. So yeah, it's totally worth getting involved because it's a project that is relevant to so many people that we do have a lot of input from a huge number of people. That's a really, really good thing about it. So on that stuff, I don't know if anyone's got any questions. Anyone wants to throw anything out there? Or?
Just ask how many people are actually using Modernizr today? Pretty much everyone there. Yeah. How do you find it? Like implementing it, things like that? Or something like bugs you found, anything?
No bugs, it's an absolute goddamn. It's wonderful.
Do you want to have a rant about anything?
Does it work if JavaScript is disabled?
No, it's a pure JavaScript library. What you do get out of it though is if you follow the kind of standard pattern we tend to recommend of having a no-js class on your HTML element, then we will then replace it. So Modernizr actually just replaces that with a JS class. So that at least gives you, within your style sheet, it gives you a way of knowing whether or not JavaScript's enabled.
It's a thing that Paul Irish wrote about conditional classes, I think, where text for like different versions of IE as well, so you can specify the IE, and within that you just got the JS there as well.
Yeah. So I think this kind of goes back to the capabilities and dependencies thing I was talking about. So if you are using, as soon as you decide to use Modernizr to detect something, and as soon as you decide to use feature detection, you're sort of inherently adding JavaScript as another dependency. It's another capability that you're depending on for your feature, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. I don't necessarily think it's bad idea for the core of your app to require JavaScript. I think nowadays we're at a point where people who don't enable JavaScript know that most of the internet doesn't work for them. There's something that, along those lines, that Carl Simpson said in the talk I saw a while ago, the guy that wrote one of the introductory to HTML5 books, where he basically is talking about non-JS users and talking about IE6 users and IE7 users. These people know that most of the internet doesn't work with what they're using. There's only so much point in trying to give them an amazing experience. You're not going to get a letter from them saying thank you. That said, there are a huge number of reasons why it is very useful to have a site that presents some content when JavaScript isn't enabled. Like I say, there's crawls, there's SEO, there's accessibility, although I think you'd be hard pushed to find a screen reader in wide use at the moment that doesn't run JavaScript. But all of these things, I think it's about knowing your audience and knowing what capabilities is acceptable for your app to depend on. And you can determine that on a feature-by-feature basis and for your core as well. So, yeah, I'll carry on a little bit then. An interesting thing we come across quite a lot, particularly in Modernizr, because loads of people want to detect everything under the sun, the undetectables. There's a page on the Modernizr wiki about this, which kind of gives some examples, but I thought we've never kind of described why certain things are undetectable, so I thought I'd go through that now. For something that we consider to be a good to detect should both get the positives right and the negatives. There's some benefit in kind of having a bit of an unknown. If you say, right, I know that this has definitely got this capability, but I don't know about this particular case. I think there are one or two in Modernizr which will actually return undefined rather than ever actually giving false. But ideally, we want to know both cases reliably. We want it to be lightweight, we want it to be small and fast. Again, that's kind of down to how accurately we can do everything. We also don't want to make assumptions, this is what I was saying earlier, but realistically, just about every detect does make some kind of an assumption. I'll give some examples of that in a minute. So, rule one, if you're trying to come up with a feature detect or something, is whatever it is you're trying to detect must interact with the document. We're in JavaScript here, we only get what we get told. We only have access to what we get told by the browser. So in terms of styling, all of the styling detects are actually heuristics in some way. Okay? So, for example, the box shadow detect in Modernizr simply determines whether or not a newly created div has the box shadow property on its style object, which is normally a decent indication that they've implemented it, it should work. Not entirely correct. Some versions of the Amazon Silk browser on Kindles supports the box shadow property, but just doesn't do anything. So there's absolutely nothing we can do to detect that. Okay. Other properties which actually change your layout, you can detect. Okay. So things like Flexbox, we don't need to because actually the browsers are pretty reliable about providing the right APIs when they've implemented it. But obviously that does cause quite a major difference to the layout. So we would then be able to detect whether or not it's had an effect on the layout. Form UIs is a really common thing. So with HTML5, there are a whole new load of form input types. You've got things like dates, times, sliders, and number inputs, and things like that. There's no real way to detect whether or not those things have UIs and whether or not they have decent UIs is the other thing, because to be honest, the original set that Chrome put out were rubbish. So because these things are presented as a layer on top of the document when you click into the box, we have no way of knowing if there's a UI there or if it's just a box. Again, we could resort to heuristics, but that's going to go wrong very, very quickly. Ideally, we don't want it to take any user interaction, particularly if we're talking about Modernizr, which we're running in the head of a document before the page is even loaded. There are certain events, people wanting to know whether the DOM content loaded event is supported. We can detect whether or not it's it's defined within the window object, which is a bit of a star. If it's not, then the chances are it's not supported at all, it's not going to fire. However, we can't necessarily tell if it's going to fire at the right time without also taking control of the entire page and knowing when it should fire, which normally means breaking someone's app. So similarly, content editable, so this is a property that you can put on just about any element in HTML5 and it just makes it so you can change it, which is brilliant. We can detect whether or not that property is supported, whether it's there, but we can't necessarily tell if it's doing the right thing once the user tries to do it. As I say there, we can quite often give accurate negatives, but not necessarily positives, which in some users might be acceptable, but not others. And there's also a matter of thinking about kind of older browsers and devices. So Windows.performance is a new spec. It's implemented in Chrome, which basically it's amazing. You basically get like a kind of time spec of how long it took to do the network requests, how long it took to do page renders, all this kind of stuff that you can access in JavaScript. Brilliant. However, older devices, we have no idea about that. So obviously we can feature detect the performance API. We can't do an accurate feature detect for things like network performance using that pattern because it's a new API and not every browser supports it. Touchscreens, bloody hell. So again, the technique a lot of people use for trying to detect a touchscreen, I'll say, is looking to see if the touch events are supported in the browser. But that's a new API. Touchscreens have been around since the 90s, and then they just emulated mouse events. So for any device, and in fact, probably the most recent device that didn't support any kind of touch APIs was basically most Nokia phones that came out last year don't support it. So obviously there are still quite a lot of those around. Again, that gives you a case where you can give some kind of good idea at a positive, but the negative case, you have no idea. So, I said don't get me started, but I'm started now. So, I had a big old rant, and a lot of people disagreed, but if you're interested in this stuff and why I'm kind of quite passionate about detecting touchscreens, I said earlier that it was kind of how I ended up getting involved in Modernizr, so it is quite a big thing to me. I wrote an article about it, and essentially all of the techniques that people try and use either use new APIs or it's heuristics. So the classic one, which I hope people are steering away from a little bit now, is assuming that basically using media queries to do a lovely responsive design so that you have like a nice narrow mobile layout and a wider sort of tablet and desktop layout, assuming that the narrow layout means it's touch and the wider layout means it's mouse. Okay, you can Panasonic now do a tablet that's about that big. Okay, that's not a narrow device and it's entirely touch. Okay, things like that. So that's a heuristic. You're just assuming that I have a device which has a small screen and is touch, therefore small screen equals touch. Those things contribute very easily, and it might seem like a good idea at the time, but it's not in the future. It sort of goes for many device features. Media queries are going to start to give us more information about this. In fact, there's a new media query, which is media query, which is for pointer, which can either have a coarse value or a fine value, which actually tells you whether it's someone stabbing at it with presumably a thumb, but it might not be. And then there's also a hover media query, which tells you whether or not it's hover capable. So these are kind of steps forward in the right directions, because what I love about them is they're not saying, are you touch? They're saying, do you have a fine pointer or do you have a coarse pointer? And do you support hover and do you not support hover? Because touch doesn't necessarily mean no hover as well. The new the Samsung Galaxy S4 as a device has a touchscreen that supports hover.
iPhone's Safari browser takes the hover state from your CSS on your first tap.
Yes. Okay. So that I guess that's a grey area because that's essentially emulating hover rather than necessarily having hover as a capability of the input device.
Oh, yeah, but what would that report to the JavaScript though if you were?
Well, it completely depends how you try and detect it. As I say, these things are very tough to detect. In terms of hover for the media query, that would be no hover because it's based. the media queries are based on information given to them by the operating system. Yeah, so the spec specifically says that the emulated hover events shouldn't be device capable of doing emulated hover events shouldn't be reported as such. Because that was put in not to be a feature, but to get around the fact that loads of people had made drop-down menus that require hover and things like that. So that's kind of an interesting space. We had a big old discussion on Modernizr about having a detect for a mouse was how it was put, which instantly kind of put my back up a little bit because detecting a mouse isn't very useful. What we want to know is whether or not it's a fine point. We want to know whether or not it's hover capable. And I think breaking devices down into their capabilities again, rather than just saying is it this device, is it that device, that's kind of the equivalent to what we're doing with browser features, right? So with browser features, we've been saying, do you support geolocation? Do you do this? Rather than are you IE8, are you Chrome, are you Firefox? I see that as the same thing. So. Right, yeah, this is kind of where I was going to start talking about this capabilities idea, where we stop kind of thinking in terms of, right, what device have I got, what input device have I got, what output device have I got, and just try and think of things in terms of the capabilities it offers. I was actually going to throw in a table here, which is, so how many of you use caniuse.com? Yeah, so most of you have seen that site. So it's basically just a big list of, got all the browsers along the top, a load of browser features down the side, and then it kind of says yes, no, or partial, depending on whether or not those browsers support those things. Now, I see input devices and output devices in the same way. I think they can be viewed in the same way. So again, you have different input devices across the top. So that might be a single touch screen, a multi-touch screen, a mouse, a keyboard, a 2-button mouse, a trackpad, all these different things. And then you have the capabilities down the side, and the capabilities are things like being able to interact, being able to do a primary interaction, being able to hover, having coarse pointing of capability, which is obviously what mice and touch input do, and stylus and things like that. But keyboard can't hover and can't point and things like that. So basically, you can produce this table with the same sorts of things. And I think the next steps then are to then work out in the same way that for all the things in Can I Use, we're trying to make feature detects in Modernizr, can we do capability detects for these capabilities of input devices that we can then start saying, my feature that I'm building here depends on these certain input capabilities. I think that's kind of where I want to see things going, and then we will need new browser APIs for these things. But yeah, I think that would be a much better way to go than people still just kind of pushing themselves against, oh, I've got this device, I've got that device, I've got that device. It becomes much more future-proof and much more flexible. So that's what hand waving. So just to kind of wrap up, really, I have no idea how long I've taken. That's all right. So just in terms of managing compatibility, I've kind of said, I think it's great if we can start thinking of the things we build in terms of a series of separate features, and each of those features have their own, the capabilities of the browser and the device they require. They also have capabilities of the user that they require, and that kind of becomes a statement of accessibility. Are you assuming that the user will be able to see this or will be able to hear this from their browser? And I think considering this stuff right at the start of the project is really, really important. Okay, so to me, the variability and the differences between different devices, different users and different browsers is what the web is, right? It's the thing that makes web software different from any other kind of software is the fact that you've got such a broad range of target platforms that you're developing for, which makes it really, really interesting, but also makes it really difficult. And embracing this stuff right at the start of your project, rather than seeing it as a, oh shit, I've got to test on all these browsers at the end of it kind of approach, I think will pay dividends and will also make us a bit happier if we just kind of get involved in this and really really sort of take it on. So, I mean, I've started on my projects, when I start planning them, I start picking out the features and saying what capabilities am I depending on for these different features. And just a sort of few, you know, rough ideas of things that might be able to help us in the future. How many of you have used require.js? Okay, so require.js is it's a dependency management library. So essentially, you define. I mentioned earlier that Modernizr has moved to AMD module format. So they look something like this. They actually say require rather than browser require. This is kind of my version. You basically list your software dependencies for a particular module, and then require.js will trace it all through, stack it all together, and make it all work, and make sure that for the modules that you're using in a particular system, you have all the dependencies there. And if the dependency isn't available, then that won't be compiled in, and it won't run. So this was just kind of something I was thinking about the other day. Could we have a browser require where we rather than describing our dependencies on other bits of software, we describe our dependencies on browser capabilities, or even device capabilities, even user capabilities, if we've got a way of the user saying, you know, this is what I can do, or these are my interests. I mean, there's so many kind of different things that you can bring in there. And again, these things will only run if those capabilities are available. So I've kind of called that browser require, and you know, maybe that's a project I might start work on. Or another version would actually be tying it in with require, which has a module system. So we can have a normal require module, normal AMD module where, say, jQuery was one of our software dependencies, but then we also have these Modernizr dependencies, and they would build in and run the necessary Modernizr tests, and then only run this bit of code if the capabilities are there. I sort of hope that might be a thing at some point. I might start working on that, but anyway, that's a go. Okay, cheers.